This is a Rattle and Hum Sports Podcast for Friday, May 10th, 2013. I'm Bryan Houston, and we're talking college football, specifically the Big 12, with the Big 12 insider, Kevin Lonnquist. How you doing, Kevin?
Doing great, Bryan. Thanks. How are you?
Doing great. Good to talk to you as always. Lots of things going on this week. It's amazing how busy an off-season can be in college football these days. We've got Bob Stoops this week making comments about the SEC, basically saying that a lot of what you read and hear about the SEC's dominance is propaganda. What do you make of all that?
Well, I think Bob has a point on this, and I recognize. Well, I'm not going to try and say that the SEC is no different than like the Pac-12 or the Big 12 or the Big 10 for that matter. I mean, obviously the fact that they've won the last 7 national championships, 5 of them between Alabama and Florida, speaks for themselves. I think the point that Bob was trying to make, and maybe he didn't articulate it as well as he would have liked to, is that I think as the conference as a whole, if you look at their second division teams, they're probably no different than what you see in the Pac-12 or the Big 12 or whatnot. Is Kentucky any better than, say, Washington State or Oregon State or Arizona State or somebody like that? No. Is Vanderbilt any better than, say, Arizona or Cal? Probably not. You got a lot of sameness with a lot of those teams in those conferences that kind of are cut from the same cloth, if you will. I think what the SEC is, in my judgment here, is that it's a very top-heavy conference. I mean, extremely top-heavy. If you look at obviously what Alabama and Florida have done, we can't discount obviously what LSU has done over the last several years. Their track record speaks for themselves, even though they've kind of had some fluky losses here in recent years. But, you know, a lot of people will start to discredit what Auburn did a couple of years ago with Cam Newton because of the scandal that the NCAA apparently looked away or looked the other way on. And I know that Arkansas had a good run with Bobby Petrino. It's interesting. We can make arguments about this stuff both ways, trying to find facts that will try and suit our argument. But the bottom line is that, look, this conference is very, very good. Their record speaks for themselves. They've won a lot of national games as far as the regular season, and obviously the national championship and their share of BCS games. I'm not denying that. And obviously Bob looks a little silly when he makes a comment like that, especially in light of the fact that his team got its head handed to it in the Cotton Bowl against a former Big 12 team that just moved to the SEC and the A&M. What I don't like about, what I think what Bob's trying to say here, and I agree with, is the fact that because A&M jumped into the SEC, it immediately ripped off an 11-2 season, but they automatically are a great SEC team. Well, I don't see that just yet. They had a great year, no question. Johnny Manziel wins the Heisman Trophy. I get all that. You know, you've got to develop a track record of success. Is A&M a one-year wonder? We'll find out a little bit more this year. I wouldn't think that they are because of the way that Kevin Sumlin's program is recruiting. But, you know, you just can't what I get upset about is how these national media organizations, in particular ESPN, will suddenly anoint somebody as this greatness when the hype doesn't match the performance. And so you've got some SEC apologists who are trying to claim, well, Tennessee is down, but they've always been good. Well, Tennessee's down. Okay, they're down. They just fired their coach, Derek Dooley, and replaced him with Butch Jones. So Tennessee's in a problem. I mean, their history speaks for themselves, but there's the key word in that is it's history. And Tennessee isn't very good right now. And so, people looked at Ole Miss's number 1 recruiting class in the country. Oh, Ole Miss is going to be great. They're going to compete for a national championship. Well, hang on a second. Ole Miss hasn't even won an SEC West title. So before we tell Hugh Freeze that you've just won the SEC West in spite of what Alabama and Arkansas and LSU have done, you need to kind of win some important games here to prove yourselves. And so that's where I'm going with, is that all of a sudden when an SEC team does something great, it's automatically branded as the bar, and no one will ever reach it. And I do think there is something to this where these other leagues are these other conferences are construed as the minor leagues. That's where I have the issue with it. And I think that's where Bob was trying to go with this.
Okay. I have to, full disclosure, I'm an SEC fan. I've grown up with the SEC. And the only thing that bothers me about what Stoops has to say is when he talks about a top-heavy conference, you're talking about 6 teams that were in the top 14 last year at the end of the season. And we're forgetting about programs like Georgia and South Carolina that weren't even mentioned in this discussion, who had huge bowl wins. And his argument is that 9 of the 10 teams in the Big 12 went to bowl games, and their bowl losses, some of their bowl losses are hideous. I mean, Tulsa has a win over Iowa State. A&M crushed Oklahoma. Oregon beat up Kansas State. And then you have Syracuse pounding West Virginia. And Minnesota, Texas Tech barely beats Minnesota. Minnesota's an average team, but I just see a lot of mediocrity there, and so I'm not quite sure that Bob Stoops was wise to even get in this argument.
But that's where I'm going with this, Brian, is the fact that when you mentioned the fact that Tech and Minnesota are probably average teams. Okay, but if you throw those into the SEC, okay, to me, they look no different than Ole Miss or Mississippi State at this point. They look no different than Arkansas. Arkansas had a bad year this year. They look no different than Tennessee. I'm going to grant you, obviously, Georgia, South Carolina. But if we want to go, we can go tit for tat all day long if we want to on this.
Sure.
If you look at South Carolina scores in the final seconds to beat Michigan in the Capital One Bowl, which was an outstanding bowl game. I mean, it was one of, we got to see Jadeveon Clowney just wreak havoc, especially on, a hit in the backfield that caused a fumble, which he recovered moments later. I'm not discounting that. Mm-hmm. But to me, what I'm saying, though, is that, and again, it goes back to what I said a moment ago, is the issue is that, Ole Miss has this great recruiting class that's coming in. And the national media, ESPN, leads the charge. I'm going to throw it right in their face on this, is that Ole Miss has the number 1 class because they're broadcasting National Signing Day when the number 1 recruit in the country announces that he signed with Ole Miss, and so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden we are led to believe that Ole Miss is now the next great program of the SEC. Well, as I said a moment ago, that Ole Miss is the only SEC West team to never play in the SEC championship game. So I think there is a perception of that even the lower rung teams in the SEC, like a Kentucky, like a Vanderbilt, that they're just far better than the also-rans, that they're better than Iowa State, they're better than Tech, they're better than Kansas, those sorts of things. And that's, to me, that's an apples and oranges thing. Sure, your conference's bowl record you'd love for it to look a little bit better because it's a one-shot deal. And sometimes it's kind of like the NIT tournament and some of those also ran bowl games, which we have too many of anyway, but that's another discussion. Is how are your kids ready to play? Do they really want to be there because they didn't maybe meet their expectations? So you're 6-6 and you're going to Memphis, Tennessee to go play against a team like Tulsa, who was more excited. And Tulsa's not a bad team. I know I'm getting off track a little bit here, but that being said, I think the conference as a whole, very top-heavy, as we mentioned, with Alabama and Florida, and I throw Georgia and South Carolina. I totally agree with you on those 4 teams. And then obviously you throw in LSU, there's 5. But when you get to teams 6 through 14, we're not even mentioning Missouri here, who came in and basically rolled a flat tire in their debut season in the conference. And I still want to wait and see what A&M does over the next couple of years to see what happens, if they're really going to be able to handle the SEC year in and year out.
Sure.
Is one of those things that you've got to see as a whole. Do teams 6 through 14 in the SEC comparable to maybe teams 5 through 10 in the Big 12? My answer is yes. I don't think there's a lot of difference between those teams in the conference. All you have to do is look at the recruiting classes in the previous 4 or 5 years and the team rankings, and which I put some stock in those team rankings. And those kids are pretty much the same way. It's a matter of how you approach those game days on Saturday, and if you're ready to play. Those kids were fielding offers from the same Iowa States, Mississippi States, Iowa State, Texas Tech. Some of those kids, they just happen to wind up going to Starkville rather than to Lubbock. and that's where you get to where I don't think there's a lot of sameness, or I should say there's a lot of sameness between those conferences once you get past the upper layer. That's what my argument is, and I think that's the point that Bob Stoops was trying to make.
And one other thing I'll just point out is that the SEC had 9 teams go to the bowls just like the Big 12 did. So, I get what you're saying. I just think that Bob Stoops would have been much better off just to leave that argument alone, particularly after the way they got manhandled by A&M. And whether they wanted to be there or not, to me, is irrelevant. You're there. You should be ready to play. So in that situation, I think Bob Stoops would have been better just to stay quiet.
Well, sure. Bob's been kind of shooting from the hip this spring based on the comments that he made about not paying athletes a stipend either. Remember, he made those comments a couple of weeks ago as well, because of the fact that with kids with tuition. But I don't know, maybe Bob just had a belly full of it about these arguments and threw his name out there, and he's certainly not backing away from his comments. So you got to respect him for that, whether or not he whether or not he wins another big game other than Texas and the Cotton Bowl remains to be seen. But but Bob doesn't have to apologize for that. I respect his opinion on some of that stuff, and again, I think that's where he's going with it. Again, you're right. The timing of it isn't that great because of the fact of what happened in the Cotton Bowl, but nonetheless, I do understand where he's coming from. At least I think I do, and that's where I'm on this. That's where I have this position on what he said.
Okay, and moving on to other things then, because it's a great off-season argument, and it's one that nobody wins, because really it comes down to what style do you like better? I mean, do you like the high-flying 7-on-7 kind of style that the Big 12 plays, or do you like old smash-mouth, great defense that the SEC plays? And so a lot of that has to do with style. A lot of it has to do with the size of stadiums. I'll be honest with you. I think that the SEC has a huge advantage in TV contracts. Once CBS became the national network for the Southeastern Conference, I think that had as much to do with the perception of the SEC as anything now, because they've got more exposure or have had 10 years more of national exposure than any of the other conferences in the country right now. And I probably think that has as much to do with it as anything.
Well, I would agree with that. I mean, they obviously pulled a coup by working out something with CBS. Everyone talks about the smash mouth style of the SEC and says, "Oh, they just play, roll up your sleeves and go after them." Here's a little secret for you. That's the way the Big Ten has always played. The difference is between the SEC and the Big Ten is that the SEC just plays it a little bit faster.
Yep.
And I'm absolutely serious when I say that, Brian. That everyone rips the Big Ten by saying, "You guys play a boring style of football." Well, here's a little information. That's exactly the way the SEC plays for the most part. They just happen to be a little bit more athletic and a little faster in the way their smash mouth works in concert to where the Big Ten's smash mouth works.
I love college football, period. Okay? I'm just gonna
It's a great sport. There's no question about it. And, and the fact that we apparently now have some conference stabilization on this, with the SEC going for the grant of rights, I think that's obviously a great thing. The other thing I was going to point out too is, we have talked, you and I have talked this week about, athletic departments who run in deficits or working on a stipend, and some of them that are working self-sufficient. That's kind of a glass is half full, half empty thing, because obviously these university presidents want their athletic departments to stop running in the red, because very few across the country, that's been as long as college athletics have been around, very few athletic departments ever run break even or in the black. A lot of them run in the red, so the university always has to help them. And so that's where a lot of these conference presidents have been turning to these mega deals with other conferences like Maryland or Rutgers going to the Big Ten, or these grant of rights that are trying to fill more coffers. But then again, who turns around and gets stuck with it? Well, it gets stuck with the parents who are trying to send their kids to college because they've got higher student fees, they've got higher tuition, because everything's going up. So it's kind of like we want our athletic teams to be really good at our alma mater, but if I want to send Junior or Missy to my alma mater, it's going to cost me 2 mortgages on my house just to get her through. So it's kind of a kind of a vicious circle that we're in.
And as the father of a soon-to-be junior in high school who is getting ready to, rob several banks to be able to fund his education, I know exactly what you're speaking about, and I feel your pain.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a daughter that's going to be a freshman in high school starting next year. I've got another one that's going to be in 7th grade, so I'm a little bit down the road from you, but I'm sure the cost what I'm going to be facing in 5 years versus what you're facing in 2 years, or it's going to be probably going to be a little bit steeper.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah, it's not going down, that's for sure. Okay.
No, it's definitely not going down, that's for sure.
Big news coming out of Stillwater as we do this podcast. It came out this morning that Oklahoma State quarterback Wes Lunt has announced he's going to transfer. He was in a fight for the starting job with Clint Chelf and with J.W. Walsh, and I guess decided that it'd be better for him to go somewhere else where he might have a better shot of getting more playing time.
I find this move really shocking, but as I started to think about this, the thing I could think about was the fact that Mike Gundy got through spring football without naming a starting quarterback. That probably might have chaffed Lunt and saying, if you're not going to name a starting quarterback and still even out there for an open competition, then someone's not going to be happy. And Mike did this last year between Lunt and J.W. Walsh without naming a starting quarterback, and they got through the year as splitting some time, and they both each got started, and then they both got hurt. And Lunt had a leg injury, which really kind of, compromised his season. But the thing about this is that it just really speaks to if you're not going to name your starting quarterback, even though that might be the trend now in college football, where college coaches are just not going to, tie themselves to one guy until they get the fall workouts in August. You're going to run the risk of maybe running off maybe the better quarterback because you won't commit to him. And that might be what we're dealing with here with Wes Lunt. And so perhaps, and the fact that he's now in the open market, obviously he's not going to go to a Big 12 school because that'll be a 2-year sit-out rule. So maybe he goes Big 10, maybe he goes Pac-12. We'll just kind of see because apparently at this point there have been no schools that have been named that he's even interested in at this time. So I think it's a big loss for Oklahoma State. Obviously now this probably puts J.W. Walsh right in the crosshairs to start, which I thought J.W. was a pretty good-looking quarterback anyway. But, the one thing about quarterbacks, as you well know, Bryan, been around the sports as long as you've been, you can never have enough of good ones in your program because as soon as you lose one, that really changes the complexion of your offense. And Gundy had, he was working with some limitations last year, but he still had pretty decent stability there, even when Lunt got hurt and then he went to Walsh, and then when Walsh got hurt, he went to Clint Chelf. So we'll just kind of have to see how the rest of the summer works out, and if indeed J.W. Walsh is now the leader for the starting job once they get the workouts in August.
And you mentioned never having enough quarterbacks. TCU, I think, was caught in that situation last year where with Pahal, when he ran into his problems and ended up off the team, and they had to go with a freshman last year. And we also saw that with LSU when Les Miles kicked Ryan Perilou off the team, and he was stuck with freshmen for guys that really weren't that great to begin with, and literally it set him back about 4 years offensively. So on the one hand, it's kind of like pitching. You can't have too much of it because it just always seems to be something that happens that changes things. Very seldom you see a quarterback who can stay healthy for the full 4 years and be dependable, and some of those guys don't stay 4 years.
Well, I'll give you two other examples that are in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I mean, go look at Baylor's roster right now. Now, it looks like it's going to be Bryce Petty's job, although Art Charles hasn't said it, but that's a little bit of a different situation down in Waco, where it pretty much looks like this is going to be Bryce Petty's job. Okay, that's fine. Bryce has been in the system for several years. He understands what Bryce wants to do with this multiple spread offensive look and things of that nature. They're probably going to be primarily more of a running team to start the year, but that's another story. But here's the thing, if Bryce Petty gets hurt, then they've got to turn to a redshirt freshman who's never taken a snap, a kid by the name of Seth Russell out of Garland, and so who knows what's going to happen after that. If Baylor's offense can look completely different if Petty gets hurt and might be lost for an extended period of time. It's the same thing over at SMU, where they've got Garrett Gilbert, who's the starting quarterback, and behind him is a kid by the name of Neil Burchin, who was coming off a knee injury, and he hasn't taken a college snap either. So if Gilbert gets hurt, then the SMU's offense looks completely different. And then over at TCU, you've got Paul Hall back, and Boykin, who are competing for the starting job, and Gary Patterson has said he's not going to name one until they hit 2 days in August. But are we going to get the same Casey Paul Hall that we saw, because he now has to be more of a choir boy this year? And he also lost his big safety valve receiver in Josh Boyce. Or are we going to get Trevon Boykin, who you hope will be a little bit better? So there's a lot of things about a quarterback position that can really change the complexion of a team. You know, it kind of reminds me, even though it's baseball, when you talk about the pitching example, I'll never forget what Whitey Herzog, the Hall of Fame manager, once said about pitching. He goes, "One thing about pitching is that these guys will get you fired every time." And it's exactly what could happen with your quarterbacking situation here. If your quarterbacking situation, your program, it goes to heck in a handbasket during the season, your whole season could turn upside down.
Absolutely, and we've seen it many times. TCU, they've set the kickoff time for the big ball game against LSU at Cowboy Stadium in the Cowboy Classic. That's going to be at 8 o'clock Central Time on August the 31st, and it'll be televised on ESPN. And that is a huge ball game for both programs, I think, this year.
Yeah, it's something that obviously they both, the two schools had a home and home worked out, but then when they were approached to do this game as a way to open the 2013 season, they couldn't pass it. You know, LSU was obviously in this game a couple of years ago when they played Oregon and just flattened the Ducks like they did. And then they went on to play for the national championship that year. But, you know, Gary Patterson has said that they like to play these types of games because, number one, they don't fear anyone, because he's put his program in a position where they don't mind playing in these games during the non-conference season, although it has more of a BCS implication now than it ever did when he was in non-BCS leagues. But at the same time, I think we get to see how their kids will handle a really big environment like this. And remember when LSU was here, by the way, there's going to be a lot of purple there, since you've got LSU purple and TCU purple there. So it's going to be hard to distinguish who is who unless LSU decides to break out the gold.
I think the sobriety level is going to separate them.
That's probably true. It's going to be fun. I think it's going to be a wonderful game. Obviously, the late kickoff doesn't bother anyone because that's the holiday weekend with Labor Day.
Well, for LSU, it's more opportunity to kind of get lubed up too.
Yeah, exactly. That's all we need is more lubed up, don't we? And so, but seriously, I think it's going to be fun to see because, you know, LSU's got some issues that they've got to deal with this year. I mean, they lost a ton of kids to the NFL. And they've got to kind of get their offense back in sync, which you and I both know, you being the LSU follower that you are, watching them on offense can be kind of a grueling experience. Mm-hmm. And so, with TCU, I still think, even though TCU should probably be a little bit better on offense because they're young wide receivers who are very impressive, will have another year of experience and they'd probably be a little bit more physical, mature. The quarterbacking situation might be a little bit of an issue. Brendan James, one of the running backs, should be back this year. And so they're going to be a little bit healthier, a little bit deeper there. But still, you just never know, especially those first games can always be kind of a weird experience, too.
This is true. Anything else on your radar this week?
We talked a little bit about the stipends that the athletic departments were dealing with and so forth. And I just think that's something that obviously, as frustrating as that is, and how college presidents really want their schools to be running in the black and being more self-sufficient. I don't know if we're ever going to get there, but I think it should be kind of interesting to see how that situation plays out and how much more, if we are done with realignment, have we finally reached an end and has something been stopped in its stretch? I really hope, you and I talked about this last week, Bryan, where I really hope that we have reached an end for realignment, because I think, in spite of what I just said about college costs going up and so forth, I really think that for the stability of the game and for the credibility of the game, that if we had gone to 4 16 mega conferences, we really would have been in a situation where college football would have looked no different than the NFL, except it's played on Saturdays and the NFL is playing on Sundays.
Yeah, I agree with you. The one thing that I'm a little nervous about when you talk about stipends and teams, trying to control their costs and get in the black, I just don't see that happening. I see with the advent of the playoff, I see more and more schools trying to pump more and more money into this thing to try to get into that playoff. I see coaches getting fired a lot quicker. I see the future, and it's going to be rugged, I think.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, it's just, but then again, we just never know how it's all going to. We all thought, 2 years ago that we were headed for the 416 mega conferences, and now we apparently have gotten that. So what we might think will happen in a couple of years may not happen.
Good point.
So it's kind of a day-by-day basis. I just hope that what's been kind of refreshing, though, this offseason is that it has been kind of quiet. It has been boring, and that's what we need. We need a little boring is what we really need for the game between the months of February and July.
Well said. Kevin, what's coming up in Rattle and Hum Sports?
Well, we're going to probably have a little bit more reaction to the West One. We'll have our take on that, and then since we are having a quiet off season, we'll probably get folks ready for the Big 12 baseball teams when they are announced for the NCAA tournament, and that'll be announced on Memorial Day. But other than that, we're kind of quiet. Of course, the Big 12 meetings for the start of the college football season will be in late January late July here in Dallas.
Outstanding. Well, Kevin, we appreciate it. Always fun talking to you, and we will talk to you next time, okay?
Make it a great weekend, Brian.
You too. Kevin Lonnquist, the Big 12 insider for Rattle and Hum Sports. This is a Rattle and Hum Sports podcast. I'm Bryan Houston. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.